Dear colleague, welcome. It's Dr. Jack, and this morning I'm here with Dr. Ximena Sanchez-Samper. And Ximena, thank you so much for joining us once again for another conference.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, we're talking the day after your presentations that you had. And again, very wonderful. And the thing that I so much appreciate about your talks is they're very grounded in the research and current research, but you always share those practical, actionable advice that you give us. That we're clinicians. We're sitting across the desk from a patient. We have to make decisions. We have to know what to say, what to ask, what to prescribe, whether it's a medication or psychotherapy or whatever it is. So I really appreciate your very actionable, down in the trenches advice.
Thank you.
So just for a few minutes, maybe you can give us some of those actionable, practical highlights from your talks.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for inviting me. I think probably some of the main take-home messages is that adolescence and young adulthood is a critical time in brain development. And that what adolescents and young adults, or what youth are exposed to during those very crucial years, can have an impact on their adulthood. So adolescence and young adulthood is a perfect time to learn a language, to become proficient in a sport, to play an instrument, because our brains are in that stage of neuroplasticity and act like sponges. The flip side of that story is that your brain's age of onset of exposure to drugs and alcohol can have a profound, mark on them as well. So it's not the same to delay your exposure to drugs and alcohol into your late 20s, maybe 30s if you want to, try things then. But starting, to use or experiment with substances at a young age can certainly predict later problematic use. So that for me is probably one of the main take-home messages. Right? Age of onset matters.
When we have a teenager who's spending a substantial part of his day high, intoxicated, that's bad enough because you can't really process things, in a normal way when you're intoxicated. For sometimes, for the majority of the day, every day, right? A lot of teens we see. But it goes beyond that, you're saying, like that it actually impacts brain development. So that changes that person forever. That's scary.
Right? Between the ages roughly of 12 to 25 is when the majority of our brain development, academic development happens as well. So one of the other things that we know about heavy cannabis use is that there is a relationship between heavy cannabis use and psychosis. Right? And it's very different to have your first psychotic break, towards, your late 20s, than to have your first psychotic break when you're still in your teenage years and you haven't been able to secure and put in your back pocket a lot of that intellectual growth that you will need for subsequent years. I think probably this sort of piggybacks on another one of the take-home messages, which is certainly that we have a responsibility as psychiatrists, as pediatricians, as parents, as teachers, to educate youth about the risks and harms of, cannabis and other drugs. But certainly cannabis or marijuana is one of those where there's a lot of misinformation and minimization about the consequences of marijuana. Marijuana this day and age, as you may have learned from the lecture, is not the same marijuana that was around back in the 60s and 70s, right? The THC content, the potency of marijuana this day and age, on a good day is around 17%, if not higher, with some of those oil concentrates or even edibles. And one of the things that we know from an epidemiologic standpoint is that when consequences are minimized, use goes up. Right? So the more youth believes, erroneously, that some of the edibles or that smoking marijuana is harmless, the more they will use. And in a country nowadays where the majority of states are placing on their ballots important things such as decriminalization, legalization of marijuana for recreational use, or medical use of marijuana, I worry that these are giving that mixed message to youth that marijuana is not harmful. and that in many ways we're placing policy before good medical practice.
Yes.
Yes. And giving the wrong messages.
Yes, and I do worry too, because it's becoming the marijuana industry is now
Correct.
an industry. I guess it always was, but now it's an official.
Much more so.
There's venture capital funds who are investing in marijuana farms and advertising and building brands. And I think it's one of those situations where, yes, marijuana being illegal and leading to long prison sentences, even for just people with kind of enough for personal use. The pendulum was too much
Agreed.
one way. It just ruined too many lives in that way through the criminal justice system. But I think the pendulum could certainly swing too far, where again it's all
Agreed.
positive. When you say mixed messages, I don't even think there'll be mixed. It'll be all like it's all great, because there'll be advertising on the internet and in magazines, all positive. And I do think, I just anticipate there will be higher rates of schizophrenia or maybe schizoaffective disorder developing here. And maybe we'll need to suffer through, again, a lot of lives ruined in that way until, we find some rational middle ground.
I agree, and that's why there has to be full clarity on the definition of decriminalization and what that means,
Yes.
and the pros and the benefits from that,
Right.
versus legalization of marijuana for recreational use and or for medical use.
Yes.
And more importantly, the laws and rules around that, about how much is allotted or allowed for both medical use or recreational use, and what exactly it is that we're talking about.
Like another point you made about the harm was it actually has been found heavy use to be associated with lowering, or you can say anticipate lowering of IQ by like 8 points, and that's huge. That's like a half a standard deviation.
Correct.
And so I think, so maybe for some teens, if the psychosis risk doesn't kind of do it for them, then kind of like telling them you're just not going to be nearly as smart as you would have otherwise been. Maybe that's a message, which is completely true and backed up by data. Maybe that would hold some people like from maybe abusing more than they would. So I do think there are countervailing messages about these cautions. There's one more thing that really made me feel very uneasy. What you were presenting is that the people who, especially the edibles, they package them up to be like candy, like you have edible gummies and candy bars, and these things are so powerful. As you were pointing out, if you eat one candy bar, that's about between maybe 6 to 20 times what a normal dose for intoxication would be. So whether you're an adult, a teenager, a child, you might, unbeknownst to you, eat way too much. And even if you're eating it because you want the marijuana high, you may be completely unaware about the dose and
Correct.
kind of in a way overdose yourself, going into some florid psychotic episode of intoxication. And that scares me. And it made me think, and this is one thing I'd like to share with the audience.
Sure.
I think if we have patients, any patient, adult or teen who has their own children, and obviously in our screening we ask them if they use any drugs of abuse, you smoke marijuana or edible marijuana, whatever it is, vaping marijuana, cannabis I should say, THC, and if they have children, just say you have to be very, very cautious. This stuff looks like candy. How are you securing that? How are you securing that? I mean, this
Correct.
stuff is made to look green and orange and blue and all colorful. It looks like candy. It is candy. It's just candy with a bunch of like high doses of 50 to 100 milligrams of THC in something that looks like one serving. That's crazy.
Yes,
it's
no,
scary to me.
I agree with you. And the study that you were referring to is the Dunedin study from New Zealand.
Yes, with the IQ you're saying.
With
yes.
the IQ, with the IQ drops, and certainly that study was done at a time in which the THC content to marijuana was much lower than the marijuana that we're seeing now. The marijuana back from the 60s, 70s, maybe close to the 80s, there was a 1-to-1 ratio between THC and CBD, which is the cannabidiol, which is the THC is psychogenic, neurotoxic, and the CBD is a neuroprotective antipsychotic. So when you had a 1-to-1 ratio, things were evening themselves out. But now, as the ratio of THC has gone up, the CBD ratio has stayed flat, has stayed the same.
Yes.
So I think that's why we're seeing, the decline in IQ, the greater predisposition for psychosis. I think we also talked about, some of the genetic predispositions, that can lead to somebody developing a psychosis under the influence of heavy marijuana, versus not. And certainly with regards to the edibles, and the marketing or the deceitful marketing to youth.
Yes, deceitful, I like that. That's very true. It is deceitful. They pretend they're like brand names, just they change it, like you had, what is it?
The Pot Tarts.
Pot Tarts, yes.
Or the Keef Cat.
Right. And they look like the real thing.
They look like the real thing, right? And so, as I said in the presentation, the last time that you shared a chocolate bar with 12 of your friends was when?
That would be the edible dose, but of course, like, who's gonna eat like a little? It's crazy, yeah.
Well, and also the amount of time that it takes for your body to digest an edible, and feel its effects also takes a lot longer, right? So when you're inhaling a substance, it's going to reach your brain, much faster than when you take it, orally.
Yes.
So what happens with a lot of youth is, they start to eat that chocolate bar, that brownie.
I don't feel anything.
I'm not feeling anything. I'm not feeling anything. I'm not feeling anything. They keep eating, until when it finally hits, and that's why the psychosis or the psychotic episode is so severe.
So it sounds to me that in our role as clinicians, that one of the things that we really need to really anticipate devoting more time to is psychoeducation.
Yes.
It's really, we may be the only person giving that countervailing message, like, hold on a second, there's more to this than all the happy talk that you're hearing. And so what else would you recommend that we could practically do as clinicians to help steer, even like, primary prevention, keeping people from even going down that path?
Well, first and foremost, I would feel very proud if people kept copies of our presentations, on their desktops or their slides on their handouts, because these, that's how I typically lay out my presentations. In a way that I hope that is very practical and psychoeducational, so that when our attendees go back home, and they're sitting in front of patients, they can say, look, I went to this interesting conference and they spoke to me about a screening tool known as the Craft. It's only 6 questions. Let me ask them to you to see what you think, right? And they can, pull that out and do it. Or they can say, when a teen is sort of challenging them, and minimizing, the consequences of marijuana, and saying things that a lot of teens say, such as, it's safe, it's never killed anyone, it can be used as medicine, it's natural, right? That they can pull out the slides and say, well, actually, let me show you some of the data on, how not everybody's doing it, contrary to what you're saying. What happens to your brain, because I have found, certainly in my practice, that when I relate to my patients, again, especially when I'm working with adolescents and young adults, like we're equals, our connection, our rapport becomes much stronger.
You don't want to talk down to them.
Oh, absolutely.
Patronize them.
Of course.
They're very sensitive. They will feel that.
Yes.
Even subtle patronization.
Correct. And and certainly the majority of them are intrigued and like learning about the brain and what happens. And I find that as a motivational tool, like educating them on what really goes on behind the scenes, and that their choices can and do matter, is very helpful. So
like what you said, that they're actually hungry to learn, like how does this affect me and my brain? And
correct.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think it certainly provides that opening. Yeah, and I think I I think as a clinician myself, I'd almost be like, oh, you know I have to talk to this teen about like the horrors of marijuana, but I know it's just like they're not going to pay any attention. I'm dreading it before I even open my mouth, right? Because I have set my own expectations in a negative way. But you're saying like, hey, let's learn. Let me share with you information.
Correct.
And here's some stuff you can look up yourself. Don't just take my word for it. So kind of taking a very positive approach. Like look at this. There's some really bad things here, but it's fascinating. And I really want you to learn more about
Correct,
this.
because if you get into that good, bad, yes, no, polarizing conversation with them, then it is like you're playing tug of war with them. And the more you pull in one direction, saying this is bad for you, because they're hearing that from their parents, right?
Yes, right.
But the more you pull in one direction, the more likely they are going to be to pull in the other, right? And then you end up alienating instead of bridging that gap, right? So maybe another sort of piece of advice or food for thought for your listeners is, if you're able to, or if you're not trained already in motivational enhancement therapy or motivational interviewing, by all means, there's various courses that are presented around the country. Learning how to use those skills to elicit change talk in teens is extremely powerful. Right? So I have found that, learning about MI has been something extremely helpful in my career.
Thank you. I agree with you. Dr. Sanchez-Samper, thank you so much. And thank you again for being part of this. So much appreciated.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Goodbye, audience.